Sisters and gentlemen, we present at this time the regular Sunday afternoon address of Father Charles E. Coughlin from Royal Oak, Michigan.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before I present Father Coughlin in today's address, I have a very important announcement to make. Several Sundays ago, Father Coughlin had occasion to mention an official British white paper in supporting a statement which he made concerning those who are prominent in subversive activities. Immediately, his critics hurried to various libraries to check this document. They reported that the edition of the British white paper to which Father Coughlin referred did not exist. Newspapers carried the story of this statement far and wide. Father Coughlin's veracity for the time was challenged, and the reading public was led to believe that he was supporting his assertions on passages from official documents which had no existence outside his mind. May I assure you that the original British white paper, in its original form, does exist, and is in Father Coughlin's possession. Once more, his critics are confounded. Do you wish to have proof of the existence of this document? Here is how to obtain it. Last week, Father Coughlin offered to distribute free to all who send a written request to him a book of nearly 200 pages containing the 9 discourses which he delivered over this microphone this season, together with a 47-page official statement by Pius XI on atheistic communism. Is Father Coughlin pro-Nazi? Is he anti-Semitic? Above all, is he pro-Christian and pro-American? These questions will be answered correctly, not by empty assertions, but by the exact words which Father Coughlin spoke over this microphone these past 9 Sunday afternoons. Accompanying this book is a faithful reproduction, an exact picture of portions of the original British white paper, which his critics intimated is non-existent. Full-sized reproductions of several pages of this precious document, together with the book of discourses, will be mailed to all who request a copy thereof. The book is for rich and for poor. It is not for sale. It is yours for the asking. Hundreds of thousands of persons in this audience will desire to possess a copy of this book, which is not for sale at any bookstore, but is available only by writing to Father Coughlin at Royal Oak, Michigan. Only these persons will have definite proof in their own possession that the official British white paper from which Father Coughlin quoted is in actual existence. Once more, may I emphasize that everyone is welcome to a copy of this book and the white paper printed for Parliament by order of His Majesty the King, in which it is stated that Bolshevism was organized and operated by atheistic Jews who have no nationality. This is the last Sunday that this announcement will be made. This is the last opportunity which you will have to acquire a faithful record of the 9 discourses which have been delivered. Whether or not you can donate even a small sum for this costly publishing venture is irrelevant. Those who can afford to do so certainly will contribute for the thousands and hundreds of thousands who cannot afford to make a contribution. Please ask for only 1 book in each letter. Write your name and address plainly. Address your letter directly to Father Coughlin at Royal Oak, Michigan. And now may I present Father Coughlin in his discourse entitled, The President's Message to Congress.
Good afternoon, my friends. Last Wednesday, every American who found it convenient listened intently to President Roosevelt's message to Congress on the State of the Union. It was a most important pronouncement because it indicated not only the Chief Executive's appraisal of the State of the Union, but also our proposed international policy and consequent future relations to the nations of the world. The main topic of Mr. Roosevelt's speech was concerned with war, with the speedy manufacture of armaments, and inferentially, with the marshalling of troops and their embarkment for foreign shores. The immediate objectives of domestic peace and prosperity were barely mentioned in this challenging but pessimistic message. Peace and prosperity so earnestly desired by every American. Although the impending conflict between the hosts of communism and Nazism is inevitable, although it would appear from Mr. Roosevelt's speech that we Americans must participate in this destiny with death, shall we conclude that there is no escape? Shall we accept complacently a predestined program of international destruction which will terminate our hopes for the realization of the ideals of Christianity and constitutional democracy implanted here by the faithful founding fathers of our country? Most certainly no. Therefore, it is well to weigh the policy of international policemanship proposed to us and for us by our President. Any pronouncements made by the chief executive of any nation having a definite bearing on peace or war, prosperity or poverty, liberty or slavery, particularly a pronouncement which is international in its scope, is deserving of careful consideration by a democratic people. Mr. Roosevelt introduced his message to Congress by speaking dispassionately of the three fundamentals upon which rests the structure of our civilization. He said, "There comes a time in the affairs of men when they must prepare to defend not their homes alone, but the tenets of faith and humanity on which their churches, their governments, and their very civilization are founded." Quickly developing this thesis, he concluded that we must prepare for war because our religious, secular, and governmental institutions are singled out for attack by a foreign aggressor, an attack which is imminent. Then he added this debatable assertion: "Events abroad," said he, "have made it increasingly clear to the American people that dangers within are less to be feared than dangers from without." Many students of history will disagree with the President in this pronouncement. For more nations have been destroyed through internal decay than have succumbed before the onslaughts of external forces. The decline and fall of the Roman Empire were traceable to the exploitation of the poor by the rich, and to the infidelity of politicians to the basic principles of natural law. The empire of Ferdinand and Isabella rotted from within. So too did the France of the Bourbons. As for America, I am confident that before any power or aggregation of powers in all this world can furl another flag in place of the stars and stripes, which symbolizes our love of freedom, of justice, of democracy, and of religion, I am confident that before this can happen, America will have decayed from within. Therefore, I fear an army of 10 million unemployed Americans more than I do an army of 10 million foreign enemies. I fear the repercussions which will eventuate from 20 million government wards who are forced to live below the American standard of life more than I do the combined forces of Europe's dictators. I fear the present pattern for political and party profit more than the plans of aggression concocted by all the dictators of Europe combined. These are elements within the confines of our nation which to me are more perilous than all the hostile threats originating abroad. Nevertheless, every sensible American even though he disagrees with Mr. Roosevelt's interpretation of history on this point, every sensible American gladly subscribes to a program of armament for defense. In a defense of war, there is not a patriot in our midst who would not spend his fortune and his life to protect our priceless heritage, not only from foreign attack, but also from the disciples of Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, and their un-American converts who are boring from within. While we recognize the imminence of the European war to be waged by the forces of Nazism against the defenders of communism, and while we are aware of the necessity to deal sternly with both communist and Nazi who are abusing our democratic institutions, nevertheless we must not permit the emotions of hysteria to warp our judgments. Thus, I ask, what enemy from without is capable of attacking us successfully? What group of enemies is capable of transporting 3 million soldiers to our shores with their necessary equipment and supplies? Do we not appreciate the impracticability of such an assault when we recognize that more than 30,000 bomb-proof ships would be required for such an expedition? It is true, as the President says, that the world has grown small, that weapons of attack are swift, that no nation can be safe if a single powerful nation refuses to settle its grievances at the council table. Nevertheless, the vast expanses of the Pacific and of the Atlantic have insulated America against any serious military attack originating from without. A plenitude of mobile weapons of defense, capable of safeguarding the Americas from Cape Horn to Alaska, a policy of good neighborliness, and a program of American relations based upon the Monroe Doctrine, I maintain that these three will obviate any likelihood of our being attacked by European or Asiatic armies. Oh, but I am more concerned over the possibility of America's being attacked from within. The press and the radio, in a sense, have made the world a very small place. So small that the price of our liberty is eternal vigilance, lest through these swift agencies the mental, spiritual, and social diseases generated in Russia, Germany, and elsewhere take root in our soil, where immigration laws enable communist and Nazi propaganda through the agency of international-minded minorities and politicians to sow the seeds of unchristian and un-American heresy. The world indeed is so small. I refer to the world of ideology. So small that it is impossible, because of the instruments of communication, to consider ourselves free from the barrage of the invisible shrapnel of propaganda. Unless, therefore, a defense mechanism is erected within our own boundaries against the program of anti-Christianity, anti-Americanism, and anti-nationalism, all the battleships, cannons, and fortifications which we can construct will never safeguard our ideals, will never protect our institutions. Today, as of yesterday, the golden words of Christ's wisdom are applicable, words which warn us that a man's enemies shall be they of his own household. Woven throughout the chief executive's address to Congress was the doctrine of internationalism, Internationalism which runs counter definitely to the traditional foreign policy incorporated in the Monroe Doctrine. In readopting and reviving the disastrous policy of internationalism first presented to us by Woodrow Wilson in 1916 and later repudiated, Mr. Roosevelt said, "We propose to do our share in protecting the Western Hemisphere, but this by no means implies that the American republics disassociate themselves from the nations of other continents." These words, indicating that Mr. Roosevelt is an ardent devotee of the late Woodrow Wilson, were supplemented by this pronouncement. He said, "God-fearing democracies cannot forever let pass without effective protest acts of aggression against sister nations, acts which automatically undermine all of us." Thus, divorcing himself from the Monroe Doctrine, which upholds a union of North and South American nations against European and Asiatic aggression, Mr. Roosevelt would substitute for it a union of democratic nations wherever they exist throughout the world. Incorporated in the President's address were several pertinent expressions related to neutrality. On our statute books, at the moment, there exist several laws defining our attitude towards foreign nations engaged in war. America has committed itself to the world on the proposition that it is not engaged in the blood business, that it will not transport in ships flying the stars and stripes munitions, armaments, and the essentials from which the merchandisers of murder obtain their profits, and that it will not extend loans for military purposes to nations already in default to the United States of America. But now we learn that Mr. Roosevelt suggests that these neutrality laws be amended to enable us to wage war indirectly against aggressor nations, nations which the de facto government of this country classifies as the aggressor. Moreover, he implies that sanctions should be instituted against such nations. Sanctions which Senator Key Pittman interprets by the word starvation. Starve the aggressor and feed the aggressor's foe. To this suggestion, many old-fashioned Americans will take exception, because once more it offends the basic principles of international relations promulgated by Washington and expressed in concrete terms by the Monroe Doctrine. The objection of these old-fashioned Americans should not be dismissed without consideration, for to them it seems ridiculous that the United States should endeavor to rectify the affairs of the old world when we at home find it so difficult to halt the progress of communism or Nazism in our midst, so difficult to liquidate unemployment, to end the evils which characterize the relations between capital and labor, to alleviate the burden of debt, to abandon an unsound system of finance, and to restore prosperity to a people in a land where there is want in the midst of plenty. Moreover, these old-fashioned Americans point out that our domestic ills have not been inflicted upon us by foreign nations, nor are foreign governments responsible for our economic or financial difficulties. Why then, these old-fashioned Americans ask, why then must we concentrate our attention upon Europe and Asia and distract it from the problems which so poignantly beset us at home? As ancient as is government itself, particularly governments which fail to solve their own national problems, is the policy of distracting its citizens from their own political and domestic evils by focusing the attention of its people upon the evils abroad, both imaginary and real. It would be irreverent to infer that our chief executive even entertained this ancient subterfuge of antiquated politicians. For no one should appreciate better than does he the economic and social misfortunes which beset our own nation, misfortunes which for 6 years he pledged to remove. While the President's message to Congress to ward off foreign aggressors insisted upon adequate defense and armaments and full control over all key facilities, it also emphasized that America could not prepare for war, either defensive or offensive, unless the vast majority of Americans were fully conscious of the underlying strength of citizenship. In plainer language, the chief executive recognizes, as should every good American, that men are not anxious to fight for a country whose government starves them, whose system of economy regiments an army of 10 million unemployed, whose system of finance wickedly confiscates their homes, factories, and personal belongings, and whose system of politics capitalizes upon the misery of a nation to regiment the impoverished into a political party of malcontent. Neither economic nor social slaves are virtuous patriots. Why, ask they, why should we risk our lives for a fictitious democracy which in reality is either a plutocracy of wealth or an aristocracy of favoritism? And the more prosperous citizens, who remember the financial and economic disasters which befell the great middle and upper classes following the World War, they ask, why should we sacrifice again the lives of our youth for the principles of liberty and democracy, when it is evident that modern war is the destroyer of liberty, the enemy of democracy, and the confiscator of property? Both rich and poor together inquire, why should a citizenry devote its energies, its resources, to building up a monument of debt, a debt drenched with the best blood of the youth of the world, for the benefit of bondholders and to the detriment of generations to come? I repeat that Mr. Roosevelt was cognizant of these simple questions when he said, our nation's program of social and economic reform is therefore a part of defense as basic as armaments themselves. Having enunciated this conclusion, our chief executive condensed in 10 short paragraphs his government's achievements in preparing America for defense through social and economic reform. 6 years ago, when he accepted the duties of president, he launched a social program which he described concisely in the following words: we are conserving and developing natural resources. We are trying to provide necessary food, shelter, and medical care for the health of our population. We are putting agriculture on a sounder basis. We are strengthening the weakest spot in our system of industrial supply, its long smoldering labor difficulty. We have cleaned up our credit system so that depositor and investor alike may more readily and willingly make their capital available for peace or war. We are giving to our youth new opportunities for work and education. These and several other portions of his program he recalled to the attention of the nation, a nation that knows that there are still at least 10 million men unemployed, 20 million citizens on relief rolls, $45 billion of added debt, a depressed nation where a policy of crop limitation is in vogue by virtue of an agricultural policy which pays farmers for not producing and confiscates their homesteads by the thousands. Certainly, all this has made us a wiser and a tougher nation. Wiser in accepting promises which questionable financial policies prevent being fulfilled, and tougher in our determination to make democracy work, to make it work, even though we must use democratic force to democratize a financial and political system which is ruled and regulated by a group of internationalists, the same group of men who financed the last war, the same group of men who are endeavoring to catapult us into the next war. Measured by the actualities surrounding us, this America of ours, which possesses 2/3 of all the commercial gold in the world, this America whose attention constantly has been distracted by activities and events transpiring abroad, this America whose chief executive officially admits that there are certain advantages in a dictatorship, for it gets rid of labor trouble, of unemployment, of wasted motion, and of having to do our own thinking. This America, surfeited with foreign thinking and with foreign philosophy, which have been imposed upon it under the guise of democracy, to rid itself of these once and for all is our determination. In doing so, America need not sacrifice either its democracy or its liberty, even though after 6 years of experiment our people are still living in want in a land of plenty. Again I say, America has had enough of foreign thinking imposed upon it. America is determined to return to American thinking based upon American principles and supported by Christian tradition. My friends, our future prosperity in no way is dependent upon our participating in an European war. Prosperity is within our grasp, and so is peace, if we will but will them. If we will but settle and bring to a conclusion our financial difficulties, our difficulties between labor and capital. Thus, millions of our people are prepared to support congressmen who are courageous enough to notify Europe and Asia and all the nations thereof that these two continents will conduct their future wars without the aid of American money and without the sacrifice of American lives. We are a patriotic people, but our patriotism is confined to the soil of the United States of America. We are a sympathetic people, but our sympathies are first extended to the lives and destinies of Americans and their children, to the lives and destinies of the exploited, to the lives and destinies of our own fellow citizens. We are a generous people. We are willing to lend aid and succor to the starving, to the drought-stricken, and to the flood-afflicted, either at home or abroad. Oh, but we have learned from the bitter experience of the last generation that our entanglements in the affairs of the families of Europe generate nothing but disaster in our own household. Millions of lives were lost or maimed. Billions of dollars of loans were repudiated. Cherished ideals were shattered when we who thought we were making the world safe for democracy
we're making it safe for the dictators. Meanwhile, our homeland has been victimized by the propaganda of these same European and Asiatic radicals who preach unmolested their gospel of hate and godlessness, their doctrine of world revolution, and their desire to reduce these United States to the same low level of Soviet Russia. While discussing this subject of neutrality and sanctions to be imposed upon aggressor nations, why, I ask, is there this sudden appeal to international and national virtue? Why is there this sudden determination to become the policeman of the world? And against whose head are we proposing to wield the official nightstick of starvation? Lenin promulgated his theory of world revolution, but what voice was raised in America to oppose him? Trotsky and Belakoon butchered 20 million Christians, but where were the presidential protests preventing our establishing friendly relations with these murderers and their successors? The Christian citizenry of Spain, whose government had been stolen by a system of political gerrymandering. These were massacred because they were Christians. What governmental voice spoke out yesterday or speaks today of the humane laws of neutrality towards Spain? What government edict prevents the regimenting of the young communists in America to join in the hunt for Christian heads? None. But on the contrary, it is reported that Mr. Roosevelt would be pleased with a loyalist communist victory. I trust that report will be repudiated. At this moment, there are few Americans worthy of the name who desire our country to participate in either European or Asiatic quarrels. The majority of our citizens are not only opposed to our being in the blood business, the majority are opposed to our attempting to be the policeman of the world. My fellow citizens, there's no need to appeal to the mothers of America to raise their voices against the futile policy of international war and our participating in it. A war planned upon the program of hastening to the succor of democracies in Europe, yes, and to the slaughter of other mothers' innocent sons. There's no need to advise the youth of America, which has been so much neglected, a youth upon whose shoulders has been inflicted the burden of death of the last war. No need to advise them to organize against being regimented as targets for the machine guns of the dictators. And there's no need to recollect for the fathers of America the causes of the last war. No need to remind them of the necessity of concentrating our attention upon the problems of America and refusing to be distracted by the propaganda of Europe. At this juncture, permit me to say that this new internationalism, so contrary and contradictory to the solid, sound nationalism preached by Washington, is not the invention of our president, Mr. Roosevelt. I am indebted to the managing editor of the Extension magazine, in which current issue there appears an article entitled, "Our New Foreign Policy to Fight and Finance the Wars of the World." I am indebted to this gentleman for this article, in which thoroughly and plainly he traces this un-American internationalism to the policies of Woodrow Wilson. Thus, in the Extension magazine article, we read that when war was declared in Europe in August 1914, President Wilson said, "The United States must be neutral in fact as well as in name during these days that are to try men's souls." After the Lusitania was sunk, Mr. Wilson reiterated his policy of nationalism on May 10th, 1915, when he said, "The example of America must be a special example, not merely because it will not fight, but of peace, because peace is the healing and the elevating influence of the world, and strife is not. There is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight." Goaded on by those propagandists in our midst who derided him for having said that there's such a thing as a man who's too proud to fight, Mr. Wilson again gave voice to sentiments which were in harmony with Washington's policy of no foreign entanglements. Oh, but these were days when the politicians of Europe and their American emissaries were determined to force the United States into the cauldron of the World War. According to the Congressional Report of March 1915, the late Senator Caraway informed the nation that our American citizens were impelled to hate the Central Powers of Europe through the agency of purchased propaganda, which I had occasion to mention last Sunday. 179 newspapers, according to this congressional report, became the official mouthpieces of the warmongers. Thus, while Europe was reaping the just rewards of its pagan policies, these same propagandists in America persuaded Mr. Wilson to present himself for a second term as President of the United States. Gradually, they began to groom and mold his mind according to the pattern of internationalism. In his first campaign speeches, however, he was warned to hold fast to his thesis of supporting American nationalism and not mentioning one word of internationalism. Thus, in Chicago, in his campaign speech of January 1916, he said, "I believe that we can serve the nations at war better by remaining at peace." And again at Des Moines, he restated his principle in words that were condemnatory of the warmongers and the propagandists who were seeking the assistance of America on the side of the Allied powers. Speaking of those men who are endeavoring to force us into the European war, he said, "I do not know what the standard of citizenship of these gentlemen may be. I only know that I, for one, cannot subscribe to those standards." But eventually, the presidential campaign was over and Mr. Wilson was elected to the chair in the White House. No sooner had this gentleman assumed office, an office which he sought and obtained on the platform of "he kept us out of war," than he said in his inaugural address of March 5th, 1917, "We have been deeply wronged upon the seas. As some of the injuries done us have become intolerable, we have still been clear that we wished nothing for ourselves, that we were not ready to demand for all mankind. The greatest things that remain to be done must be done with the world for a stage and in cooperation with the wide and universal forces of mankind." Oh, how shall future historians appraise this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde policy, which, in the mouth of a candidate for office, had pledged to keep us out of war, and in the mouth of a holder of office was determined to hurl us into the maelstrom of destruction? My friends, Mr. Wilson told us that we must become citizens of the world, that we are forged into a new unity, that the world is our stage. These thoughts are nebulous dreams woven upon the loom of idealism, but impractical realities in a world whose family of nations is as diversified in their lives as are the families of any major city. We are citizens not of the world, but of the United States of America, descended from ancestors of Europe deprived of their rights to life, liberty, and to happiness. Practical-minded ancestors who fled Europe to establish a new nation, our nation, and unfurl a new flag, our flag, symbolic of a new unity based upon the unity of our Constitution. We are not citizens of the world. In reviewing the speeches delivered by President Wilson, I have outlined for you the birth of an American internationalism. An internationalism purchased by the finances of the international bankers, an internationalism which gave birth to the depression from which we have not yet emerged, an internationalism which has starved millions of our citizens, an internationalism which balanced our credit system by confiscating the homes, farms, factories, jobs, and properties of those who were forced into idleness, an internationalism which dampened countless pillows with the tears of countless thousands. It is well for President Roosevelt to say that the problem of idle men and idle capital is the problem of Congress, but tracing it back to its origin, on the validity of the quotations which I have made from President Wilson before election and after election, this problem originated with those who taught him the unsound internationalism with its consequent horrors, from which we have not yet escaped. Pause, my friends, to compare President Wilson's second inaugural address of March 5th, 1917, with Mr. Roosevelt's recent message to Congress on the State of the Union. The same philosophy of internationalism dominates both speeches, and the same sentiments contrary to those in the minds of the Founding Fathers pervade the policies of both presidents. Mr. Wilson said almost 22 years ago, quotations, "The greatest things that remain to be done must be done with the world for a stage, and in cooperation with the wide and universal forces of mankind, and we are making our spirits ready for these things." And Mr. Roosevelt said just a few days ago, "The world has grown so small and weapons of attack so swift that no nation can be safe in its will to peace so long as any other single powerful nation refuses to settle its grievances at the council table. We have learned that God-fearing democracies of the world, which observe the sanctity of treaties and good faith in their dealings with other nations, cannot safely be indifferent to international lawlessness anywhere." These are the quotations. We are too well acquainted with the sad effects which resulted from the practice of Wilsonian internationalism. I ask you, shall we venture again to experiment with disaster, to have a rendezvous with depression, having learned our lesson once? My friends, we are confronted today with the same spirit of godless internationalism which once spurred on the horsemen of the apocalypse since the beginning of civilization's day. Astride the red beast of war, as described in the 6th chapter of the Apocalypse, there sits the merchandiser of murder. Mounted upon the black horse of famine, there rides the international banker. And lo, there comes thundering down the corridors of time a pale half-breed steed, sired by pestilence and mothered by poverty, and guiding him are the lean hands of the professional radical politician. From the distance of the horizon, where the light of hope seems to merge with the darkness of despair, there sound the hoofbeats of the white horse, the white horse of the apocalypse. Mounted on this peerless charger, there sits one with bow and arrow in hand and crown of gold upon his head. He is the Christ. His charger is the Christian church. As he approaches the scene of conflict, the standard of his cross is raised aloft, and so are the standards of his enemies: war, famine, and pestilence. Each standard bearer summons his followers. The divine tournament begins with odds against the white horse. The hours of conflict are marked by the savage persecution of the Caesars, by the momentary triumph of the age of faith, by the rise and fall of feudalism, by the dissolution of Bourbonism, by the advent of crass materialism with its Napoleon Bonaparte, its financial slavery, its world war, and the seeming triumph of the red horse of Soviet Russia. Long into the afternoon of time, the struggle between Christ and chaos moves across the fields of civilization. Famine and pestilence seemingly victorious at one moment, Christ supreme the next. The red horse of international war at one instant preparing for a mortal charge. The white horse of godliness rescuing his rider at another. Oh, but in this twilight hour of the world's short day, civilization knows that the contest is approaching an end. It is Christ and the white horse, or war and the red horse. My fellow Americans, whom shall we support? The rider astride the white horse of Christianity, or the demons of death mounted upon the steeds of destruction? Oh, Americans of this generation, it is our business to arm defensively, not so much against the aggressors from abroad, but more against those propagandists of godlessness, of unchristianity from within. It is our further business to divorce ourselves from the internationalism which received the benediction of the merchandisers of murder through the mouth of Woodrow Wilson, and return to the sound nationalism, the wholesome constitutional democracy of Washington and Jefferson. We at home can solve our problems with our Christian religion and with our American patriotism. Thus it is your duty to choose today, you who hear my voice, or else it is yours to regret tomorrow. In conclusion, may I set down for you two memorable statements, one from Washington and one from Jefferson, together with two statements uttered by Woodrow Wilson, the originator of the present-day internationalism. In his farewell address, the father of our country said, "Why quit our own to stand on foreign ground? Why, by interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, why entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambitions or rivalships, humor or caprice? So spoke the man who led our founding patriots to victory. So spoke the father of our country who risked his life that it may be born. At a later date, Thomas Jefferson reminded us that peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, but entangling alliances with none. Following these policies, we pursued a path of peace and prosperity for almost 150 years. And relinquishing these policies of Washington and of Jefferson, we, the wealthiest nation in the world, are rapidly sinking to the low level of the Europe from which our ancestors fled. Compare these two statements with those of Woodrow Wilson. He said on March 30th, 1917, quotations, "We are saying to all mankind that we are now ready to come to your assistance and fight out upon the fields of the world the cause of human liberty." And again on June 9, 1917, he said, "America is fighting for the liberation of peoples everywhere from the aggressions of autocratic force." My friends, we have been prepared to go everywhere and arrive nowhere since the date of that speech of President Wilson. Everywhere except to safeguard our own institutions at home. Everywhere to mind other people's business and permit our own citizenry to be exploited by an undemocratic system of finance and an undemocratic policy of government. We have gone everywhere and have neglected the best blood of the world, our working men, our farmers, our youth. Again, I say it is yours to choose. It is either America for the Americans, or shall it be America the policeman pledged to fight and finance the wars of the world, pledged to solve our unemployment problem by fertilizing the fields of Europe with our youth, pledged to enter the conflict between Nazism and communism on the side of the latter, and pledged to observe the spirit of the law of internationalism? Or shall we go back to Washington, to Jefferson, and to the Monroe Doctrine on the principles of democracy and religion? My friends, I invite you to write to me this week for a book containing the past 9 addresses, together with official reprints of official documents. Good afternoon. God bless you.
Your attention, please. The 9 previous discourses delivered by Father Coughlin, together with an official statement on atheistic communism by Pope Pius XI, are now printed in book form. This book is free for the asking. It is for rich and for poor. Whether you can afford to contribute towards its printing is irrelevant. And of great importance, with this book there will be mailed full-page size pictures of the original British white paper, which Father Coughlin's critics inferred was non-existent. The British white paper is the official British document from which Father Coughlin quoted in the discourses which these same critics called anti-Semitic. Of course, every person wishes a copy of this book and these documents. Write directly to Father Coughlin at Royal Oak, Michigan for your copy. Please do not ask for more than 1 book in your letter. Your request will be filled as soon as possible. Because Social Justice magazine is not sold at regular newsstands, the magazine edited by Father Coughlin, you are requested to write directly to him or to arrange with some local storekeeper to act as the distributor. Next Sunday at this same hour and over these same stations, this broadcast, which is paid for at full commercial rates and which depends upon the contributions of this audience, will present Father Coughlin in another stirring address. Until then, this is your announcer, Franklin Mitchell, bidding you good afternoon.
We've presented the regular Sunday afternoon address of Father Charles E. Coughlin from Royal Oak, Michigan. The thoughts and opinions contained in this address were entirely those of the speaker and in no way reflect the policies of this station.
This was a presentation on your dial at 1250 kilocycles. WHBI, Hoyt Brothers Incorporated, Newark, New Jersey.